The morning air in the New Mexico Territory was a biting cold that clawed at the lungs. Billy sat by a small, flickering fire, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The brew was bitter and scorched, but the warmth was the only thing keeping the frost from settling into his bones. A few yards away, a small desert willow sapling struggled against the wind, its roots clinging to the cracked earth, the only green thing for miles. "Only if you want it to be," Billy whispered to the plant, his voice barely a rasp. He ran a thumb over the cold steel of his Colt 45, feeling the familiar weight of his autonomy. To him, the gun was a key, a document of his own making, a lock that only he could turn. He looked at the horizon, where the sun began to bleed a violent orange over the jagged peaks. A low vibration hummed through the ground before the sound of hooves arrived. Billy didn't reach for his gun. He simply waited. Out of the shifting dust and morning haze, 3 Mescalero Apache warriors appeared, their ponies silent as ghosts on the soft sand. Their leader, a man whose face was a map of deep arroyos and ancient wisdom, stopped his horse 10 paces away. The scent of sage and old leather drifted toward Billy, clashing with the smell of his own wood smoke. "The town ahead is a mouth of dry teeth, little boy," the chief said in a voice like grinding stones. He pointed toward the valley where the distant silhouette of Fort Sumner sat. "The wind there does not sing, it warns. If you cross the river, the earth will no longer recognize your shadow. It is a place where the law has grown a taste for the blood of the young." Billy stood up, the rough fabric of his wool coat scraping against his shirt. He looked at the sapling, then back at the chief. He felt the silver pocket watch in his vest, a heavy reminder of the minutes he had stolen from the hangman. He offered the chief a small pouch of tobacco, a silent gesture of respect for a culture that understood the land better than any sheriff ever could. "I've been told the weather is fine this time of year," Billy replied, a reckless grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. The chief didn't smile back. He looked at the sapling, then at Billy's eyes. He saw the fire there, but he also saw the ash. The Apache turned their horses, vanishing into the shimmering heat haze as the cold morning began its rapid transformation into a punishing noon. The heat began to rise from the desert floor in wavy ribbons of distortion, turning the receding figures of the warriors into flickering spirits of oil and shadow that seemed to bleed back into the land. Billy watched them go until they were nothing more than a memory against the vast, indifferent blue of the horizon, his calloused fingers brushing against the cold, smooth glass of the pocket watch in his vest. A mechanical heart that pulsed with a time the wilderness didn't recognize. The smell of the tobacco he'd gifted lingered in the stagnant air, a sweet, earthy scent that briefly masked the metallic, biting tang of the rising dust. He felt the weight of the chief's prophecy settling in his stomach like a cold stone, yet the reckless grin remained etched on his face, a mask he had worn so long it had become more real than the boy beneath it. The silence that followed the Apache's departure was not empty. It was heavy and expectant, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first step of a man walking toward his own ghost. He moved toward his bay mare, the leather of his saddle creaking with a familiar, mournful sound that echoed the chief's warning about the wind that did not sing. The horse shifted her weight, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the river, a muddy, brackish smell that spoke of the physical frontier he was about to cross, a boundary between the lawless freedom of the range and the structured trap of the town. Billy looked down at the struggling sapling one last time, noticing how its thin leaves trembled even when the air felt dead, a fragile defiance against the sun's relentless glare that mirrored his own stubborn autonomy. To him, Fort Sumner was not a mouth of teeth, but a destination where he could finally turn the key on his own fate, believing his silver watch and his quick draw made him the master of every hour. He ignored the way the atmosphere thickened as he descended into the valley, the temperature climbing, until his wool coat felt like a heavy shroud. and the town began to emerge from the haze like a collection of bleached skulls, half buried in the silt. As the first line of sun-cracked fences appeared, marking the threshold of the settlement, the sound of the wind changed from a low desert hum to a sharp, whistling hiss between the gaps in the weather-beaten wood. The smell of civilization rushed out to meet him, charcoal from a forge, the sour stench of spilled rye, and the faint, flowery ghost of lavender that seemed entirely out of place in a valley of dust. Every shuttered window he passed felt like a dead eye, reflecting nothing but the harsh midday glare and his own solitary figure, a boy who had stolen too many minutes from a world that was finally coming to collect. He noticed a single raven perched on a hitching post, its feathers oily and dark, watching him with a predatory curiosity that suggested it had already tasted what the law was preparing for him. The dust, kicked up by his mare's hooves, hung in the stagnant air like a grey veil, refusing to settle, as if the earth itself was reluctant to accept the shadow of a man the chief had said it would no longer recognize. They watched. The heat became an arrogant hammer by midday. Billy rode his bay mare toward the outskirts of the town, the rhythm of the spurs clinking in time with the horse's heavy breathing. The silence of the desert was absolute, broken only by the occasional whistle of the wind through the ribcage of a dead steer. As he approached the river, he saw the physical border, a collapsed wire fence that once marked a rancher's dream. "Only if you want it to be," Billy muttered, echoing his morning prayer as he guided the mare across the rusted wire. The hooves splashed through the shallow, muddy water of the Pecos, the sound echoing too loudly against the silence. He stopped at the edge of the main street. The town smelled of stale beer, sun-bleached wood, and something metallic, the scent of waiting lead. He dismounted in front of the livery stable, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy, hollow thud. The dust kicked up around his ankles, coating his spurs in a fine grey powder. To his left, a young girl sat on a porch, clutching a bundle of dried lavender. The scent was cloyingly sweet, a stark contrast to the smell of manure and gunpowder that usually followed him. She looked at him with eyes that had seen too many sunsets and not enough dawns. "You shouldn't be here, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling like a leaf in a gale. "The sheriff has been cleaning the cells since Tuesday. He says the floor needs a new coat of red." Billy tipped his Stetson, the rough felt familiar under his fingers. He felt the tension in the air, a physical pressure that made the hair on his arms stand up. Inside the stable, the air was cooler, but thick with the smell of hay and old sweat. Billy began to unsaddle his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He checked the action on his Winchester, the sliding metal making a sharp clack-clack that seemed to ring through the entire valley. He knew he was being watched. Behind every shuttered window, the town was holding its breath, waiting for the spark that would turn the dust into a furnace. They watched. Billy walked into the saloon, the swing doors creaking on dry hinges like a funeral dirge. The interior was a cavern of amber light and thick tobacco smoke. At the bar, a man with a tin star pinned to a greasy vest turned slowly. This wasn't Pat Garrett. It was a deputy with a face like a slapped ham and eyes full of cheap whiskey and borrowed courage. The smell of frying bacon drifted from the back, a domestic scent that felt like a lie in this den of killers. "I heard a rumor you were coming to settle a debt, kid," the deputy said, leaning heavily against the polished mahogany bar. "But the only thing we're giving out today is 6 feet of dirt and a prayer if you're lucky." Billy didn't answer immediately. He reached for a bottle of rye, the glass cool against his grime-streaked palm. He poured a shot, the amber liquid swirling like the dust outside. "I'm just here for the shade, partner," Billy said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at the heavy iron lock on the back door of the saloon, a symbol of the town's fear, a barrier meant to keep the wildness out. He realized then that the town wasn't a cage for him, but a cage for them. They were terrified of the boy who didn't care about their borders or their documents of ownership. The heat in the saloon was stifling, a thick blanket of humidity and resentment. Billy took a sip of the rye, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the pounding in his temples. He thought of the Apache chief's warning. The earth here felt hungry. He could feel it through the soles of his boots, a vibration of old bones and unfulfilled promises. The deputy's hand twitched near his holster, a nervous, jerky movement that signaled the end of the talking. She couldn't. The girl on the porch had tried to warn him, but the gravity of his own legend was pulling him toward the center of the storm. Billy set the glass down with a soft click. The silence in the room became a vacuum, sucking the air from the lungs of every man present. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and bringing the scent of the desert willow, the sapling from the morning, back into his mind. He noticed. The dim light of the saloon carved the faces of the patrons into jagged masks of suspicion, their silhouettes hunched over scarred card tables like vultures waiting for a carcass to cool. Every man in the room seemed to shrink away from the bar, leaving Billy and the deputy in a circle of dead space where the very air felt brittle enough to crack under the weight of an unspoken sentence. The smell of the rye was sharp and medicinal, a biting scent that cut through the heavy, stagnant fog of stale cigars and the oily, domestic aroma of bacon grease drifting from the kitchen. Billy's fingers remained steady on the shot glass, the cool moisture of the condensation seeping into the deep, dry fissures of his calloused skin, a tactile grounding against the dizzying electric surge of adrenaline. He looked at the heavy iron lock again, its dark metal pitted and cold, representing a desperate, futile attempt by these men to bar the door against a chaos they had helped create with their own greed. Outside, the wind slammed against the saloon's sun-bleached siding with a sudden, violent force, making the shutters dance against the windows like the chattering teeth of the mouth the chief had described. In that frantic instant, the scent of the desert willow from the morning, a ghost of green life and damp earth, seemed to seep through the cracks in the floorboards, clashing violently with the indoor stench of fear and unwashed wool. Billy felt the vibration of the ground once more, not from approaching hooves this time, but as if the hungry earth beneath the town was growling, impatient to swallow the blood that the law had grown so fond of tasting. The silver pocket watch in his vest felt inexplicably hot now, a branding iron against his ribs, reminding him that the minutes he had stolen from the hangman were being repaid in a currency he couldn't afford to lose. The heat in the room surged, a stifling, suffocating wave that made the deputy's sweat-stained collar look like a noose tightening with every shallow, terrified breath the man took in the suffocating silence. The silence that followed was a physical entity, heavy as lead and just as deadly, pressing against Billy's eardrums until the only sound left in the universe was the rhythmic, frantic clicking of the deputy's spur against the brass footrail. He noticed the way the amber light caught the jagged edge of the man's brass star, a cheap piece of tin that offered no more protection than the bundle of lavender the girl on the porch had clutched like a rosary. Billy's gaze didn't flicker, it remained locked on the deputy's pupils, seeing the grey ash of a man who had already surrendered his autonomy to the borders and fences of a corrupt territory. The vacuum in the room reached its absolute breaking point, a moment of stillness where the domestic scent of bacon and the wild scent of willow finally merged into the singular, unmistakable metallic smell of impending violence. He moved his hand slowly away from the glass, the motion so fluid it seemed to happen in a different layer of time, and for a heartbeat, the frontier wasn't a place on a map, but the 2 inches of air between his holster and the inevitability of the first shot. They watched. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon when Billy stepped back out onto the street. The shadows were long, black fingers reaching out to claim the dust. The sheriff stood in the middle of the road, a silhouette of iron and law. He didn't speak. In the West, words were for the living, bullets were for the transition. Billy felt a strange peace, The silver watch in his pocket ticked against his thigh, a heartbeat that wasn't his own. "You were warned, Bonnie," the sheriff finally called out, his voice echoing off the adobe walls. "The chief told you the wind doesn't sing here. It screams." Billy adjusted his hat, the texture of the brim rough against his skin. He looked at the river, the physical choice he had made to cross. Beyond the sheriff, he saw the Apache warriors perched on the ridge, silent observers of a ritual they had seen 1,000 times before. The duel was a blur of motion and thunder. The Colt 45 jumped in Billy's hand, the recoil a familiar kick against his palm. Smoke bloomed in the air, white and sulphurous, obscuring the world. When the haze cleared, the sheriff was on his knees, not dead but broken, his badge reflecting the last of the light. Billy walked toward him, but he didn't fire again. He looked at the man's hands. They were soft, the hands of someone who signed papers instead of digging graves. "You think this is justice?" The sheriff spat, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "You're just a ghost in a hat, kid. This land belongs to the fences now." Billy looked up at the ridge. The Apache chief raised a hand in a slow, solemn arc. It wasn't a salute, it was a farewell. The warriors turned and vanished, leaving Billy alone in the middle of a town that hated him, standing over a law that couldn't stop him. The silence that rushed back into the street after the thunder of the shots was a physical pressure, a cold vacuum that smelled of burnt powder and the metallic tang of the sheriff's blood soaking into the parched earth. Billy stood motionless, his boots anchored in the grey dust that refused to settle, while the distant sweet scent of lavender from the girl's porch drifted through the sulphurous haze like a ghost of a life he could never lead. He felt the silver pocket watch vibrating against his leg, a frantic mechanical heartbeat that mocked the stillness of the man dying in the mud before him, and realized that his victory was just another lock he had turned, only to find himself in a larger, more desolate cage. He noticed how the townspeople still didn't emerge. They remained behind their shuttered windows like cowards, hiding from the very darkness they had invited with their fences and their hollow laws. He turned away from the broken man and walked toward the livery stable, his spurs singing a lonely, rhythmic dirge that was the only sound in the suffocating twilight. The temperature had plummeted with the setting of the sun, the biting frost of the high desert clawing at his throat as he led his bay mare back toward the physical threshold of the river he had crossed with such reckless arrogance. The water of the Pecos looked like black oil under the first stars, a freezing boundary that separated the jagged, toothy mouth of the town from the indifferent sanctuary of the wild mesas. He reached the bank and paused, looking down at his own calloused hands, hands that were stained with the dust of the trail and the shadow of the law, and felt the weight of the document he had written in lead. "Only if you want it to be," he whispered to the freezing wind, the phrase now a bitter taste of copper and regret on his tongue. Standing at the edge of the swirling current, Billy pulled the silver watch from his vest, its polished surface reflecting a sliver of cold moonlight that felt as sharp as a blade against his palm. He thought of the struggling sapling and the Apache chief's warning, understanding finally that his autonomy was a burden that required a heart of ash to carry through a world of hungry fences. With a slow, deliberate motion, he cast the watch into the center of the river, the small splash instantly swallowed by the roar of the water as the mechanical heartbeat sank into the mud to be forgotten by time itself. He spurred his horse into the dark, leaving the town of Dry Teeth behind, a ghost in a hat, riding toward a horizon that offered no forgiveness, only the infinite, silent expanse of the land. She couldn't stop him, and the law couldn't hold him, but the earth now recognized his shadow as part of its own jagged, broken landscape. They watched. Billy walked to the livery, his steps light, almost weightless. He found the sapling he had passed that morning. Someone had stepped on it, snapping the main stem. He knelt in the dirt, the cold returning to the air as the sun disappeared. He touched the broken wood, feeling the sap, sticky and sweet, like the girl's lavender. He realized then that survival wasn't about winning. It was about the persistence of the roots that remained under the surface. He mounted his horse and rode toward the river, the dark water reflecting the first stars. He looked back at the town, now just a cluster of shadows and flickering lamps. He reached into his vest, pulled out the silver pocket watch, and dropped it into the Pecos. It sank without a sound. A piece of autonomy returned to the mud. As he reached the far bank, he whispered to the wind, his voice finally at peace with the desert. "Only if you want it to be." They watched.